Welcome, everyone, to the next episode of the Corner Table Podcast, a podcast by world builders for world builders. We're doing our first list. I'm excited today. My name's Xavier. I'm also joined by a couple other people.
I'm Kevin.
And Braylon.
Welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about the most impactful worlds in fantasy, to be specific. We'll get a bit into the criteria. Just know that our opinions are correct, even if we don't agree.
Correct.
These are the only three stances you can take. If you disagree, you could leave a comment, but you know, words don't change the universe. We're not in one of these magical worlds where you can just say something and it shifts.
These are the definitive three options for top five.
Yes.
Yes. So pick whichever one you like most, but
Yeah.
do not blend them.
Do not blend them. That's not allowed.
That's not allowed.
So when we're going to talk about what is the most impactful fantasy world, you have to have some kind of criteria.
Yeah.
Now, your criteria could be as simple as vibes. I would hope not. That would make it harder to argue later.
Well,
Yeah, well, maybe.
it's hard to argue with vibes, man.
It's true.
It's hard to argue either way. But I think all three of us came up with some criteria for their list. So Braylon, what did you put down?
So mine is I'm judging on a number of things. I'm not judging based off of my own preference. I'm not judging based off of what do I think is the best world. I'm judging based off of what do I think had the largest impact both in the genre and culturally. So something that, you know, really defined a genre but is largely unknown, probably not going to make the list. Something that, you know, created this huge new phenomena, but that was only used once, probably not going to make the list. I'm looking for kind of a blend of those two things.
It's fair. We're not doing the best fantasy world or the favorite.
No.
Most impactful.
Yeah, there are a couple a couple things on my list that I am only partially familiar with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's just kind of how it goes.
But I think I can still argue for their impact, just not like I can't really go in depth on the material itself.
Okay. Yeah, my criteria is pretty similar. I basically said three things.
Yep.
One is that it inspired future writers. So people who are creators, people who create were inspired by it and took cues from it. Number two is that it was popular, like it excited people. It has to be at least a base level of successful, even though there's some things, like there are people who inspired Tolkien. They don't necessarily make the list because their works aren't very well known.
Yeah.
That's just kind of how it goes. And the third is just that they spawned copies or inspired works. Even if something was not particularly well done, as long as a lot of people copied it, it has had a lot of impact.
Yeah.
So how does that differ from your first criteria?
So the first one is more so that it is, again, inspirational versus just... It's harder to explain as I put it down here. It's mostly just that like some of these are very popular among creators.
Yeah.
And then some of these are very successful and then people copied it.
Yeah.
Or it's very successful and then people took pieces of it, even if they aren't necessarily thought of as being a great work by other creators.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's two of your criteria are very similar to what I have written down for mine. So I had three factors that determined where something would land on the list if it made it onto the list.
Okay.
And so the first two would be influence or in a way inspiration, and the other would be sort of coming off that is popularity.
Yep.
And then I put down as a third factor is very minor is sort of novelty of
How
did
original
you
is this?
right did you do something better than just aggregating a bunch of things that came before and becoming the inspiration?
Sure.
But that's a very minor factor because most things that actually become genre defining become that way because they did something original.
Yeah.
For the most part, yeah.
But for me, it wasn't enough to just have those things. I also had to come up with, okay, so what actually is a candidate to be on this list in the first place? And so for me, I said, okay, well, we're ranking fantasy world. So it has to actually be a setting, not just a story. And that's the criteria here. And so if it's not a well-defined setting, it doesn't count. So something like the world of D&D is not very well defined.
Sure.
It has rules. That's great. But the actual setting is broken out into multiple ones. It has to have a well-defined canon. So something like the stories of King Arthur, as influential as they are, can't really be pinned down to, well, it's actually this one particular story or set of stories that became the basis for it.
Yeah.
And then the third,
go ahead.
Right. And the third is that it has to be an explicit work of fiction by the person who originally put it together.
Okay. So you're basically excluding like Homer.
Yes. So Greek mythology,
gotcha.
and especially, so Greek mythology also sort of runs into the source issue for a lot of it.
Yeah.
But something like Norse mythology, where we can trace back to, well, we have a couple of well authenticated sources for this.
Mm-hmm.
That's great, but we don't know if the person writing this was actually treating as these are what the Norse people believe and I don't believe it, or these are stories and I'm not really concerned about whether or not it's true. And so if it's the latter, then it doesn't really qualify as fantasy, even if we don't believe it in the modern era.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, we said fantasy.
Yeah.
So there are some non-fantasy worlds that are very impactful that don't even make the list.
Yeah.
Because they're not fantasy.
Yep.
We could do all kinds of things, but maybe we will later. But with fantasy,
the internet does love a list, so
it's true. Anyway, that's our criteria.
Mm-hmm.
That's how we came up with the list. We're going to do these things the natural way. We're going to count down from 5. Oh, I don't know if I said. Each of us selected 5.
Yep.
They're a different list of 5, I think.
Yeah.
Should be.
They are at least different lists. They may have crossover. We'll see.
I would hope so. If they don't, we're in trouble. But we're going to start from number 5. Who wants to go first? It's not going to be me.
I'll go first because my number 5 has already been dissed by somebody.
Okay.
And that is the world of D&D.
When Kevin mentioned it, I was like, interesting.
Yeah, I think while yes, I do agree with your statement of it is very dispersed. It's not super duper well defined. I think that world that there are boundaries there.
Yeah.
And the fact that there is space for other people to enter in and create within the bounds of this world, I think that has been incredibly impactful, as well as just D&D as a whole being incredibly impactful in the fantasy genre.
Oh, absolutely.
I think just granted, they've taken a lot of inspiration from some of the stuff later down on my list and some of my honorable mentions as well. So it's not like they're entirely original. A lot of it is just taking stuff that already existed to an extent and making it work within this world that they created. But I think as far as like social impact, it's huge.
Yes.
Yeah, it's way more so recently. D&D has had kind of a resurgence recently.
Yeah, really big in like the 80s and then now.
And then now. There's so much of it now. But it's true. It has a lot of impact directly in terms of people actually playing Dungeons and Dragons, tabletop RPGs in general, just borrow from Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah. But then, there's just a lot of tropes that are from Dungeons and Dragons
specifically
that get brought up elsewhere. So I totally get that part.
An interesting example of that would be like the way that D&D does magic.
Yeah.
So, in a lot of fantasy settings where you have to have the magic hard enough that you can actually like do it in pen and paper, it usually comes down to like one of two systems, which is going to be you have some sort of energy pool, or you have like this spell slot D&D system, which D&D didn't even come up with.
No.
That came from an author before D&D, which I actually considered like, so do I put that on the list because that particular magic system has now carried through?
Yeah.
Yeah. But in the same way that I wouldn't count a lot of old folk stories over some of the things that make the list in terms of fantasy.
Yes.
It's like, it does make way more sense in my mind to have D&D.
Yes.
Now, but to your point, Kevin, you excluded it because you think, what was your reason again for why D&D wouldn't make your list? Which one was it?
Because it had to be a well-defined specific setting.
Yeah.
Okay. That's kind of fair. So what is not defined about the D&D setting?
So, for example, can you name a location in D&D?
Town. Yeah. Tavern.
Waterdeep.
See, so Waterdeep is part of a D&D setting.
Yeah.
Not part of D&D itself.
Sure.
So when you say the world of D&D, there are multiple different settings for D&D.
Right.
All of which are valid, and one of which I could say you could put that on the list.
Right. So I mean, if you want me to like put something specific, I could do Faerun or Toril or whatever. Like if we want to get super specific, I could do that, but I wanted it to be a little bit more overarching than that, because I don't. Yeah. I think like the world of D&D is kind of its own thing.
True.
I feel like with D&D, there's like there's a style of world that D&D has created that has been very pervasive in fantasy.
Yes.
But at the same time, it's not like way more than I'm guessing everything else on your list and most of our lists.
Correct.
There's not like places, characters.
Right.
None of that stuff carries over.
Yeah.
It's just all the rest of this jazz.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And that is ultimately why it's my number 5, why it just kind of ekes onto the list. And probably there are other things in my honorable mentions that could take this place.
Yeah.
I mostly just wanted to have something that wasn't a book, because all of the rest of mine are books.
Wow, it's a book lover over here. What the heck?
Well, if it makes you feel better, I also took a commercial setting for my number 5.
Okay, go for it.
So I took Azeroth by Blizzard Entertainment.
Okay.
Is that the WoW setting?
Yes, that is the setting in WoW. I don't know if it's also the setting for the Warcraft games before it. But it's also, again, sort of like you said, it's not that there's a ton of like published work that draws from this, but it's been so influential in the people's perceptions of fantasy.
Yep.
That for a lot of people, it's when you think fantasy, they think, oh, Azeroth.
Yeah.
Now, I will say, a question on that one. That's fair. Mm-hmm. Couldn't you kind of argue that in a lot of ways, Warcraft is just copying Warhammer Fantasy, which is also a pretty major work?
Yep.
Because in a lot of ways, I feel, isn't Warcraft just like Warhammer Fantasy, but a little less serious?
I know almost nothing about this world, so I'm just gonna take
Which
a
one?
backseat.
Both? Either one? Okay.
I believe so, but from my understanding, and with the caveat that everything on this list is going to be colored by, well, what's my personal gauge of what's popular?
Yeah.
Is that when people think of the things that are in Azeroth, they're going to think of the version that Azeroth portrays and not from Warhammer, which came before.
Sure.
That's
right.
fair.
And so even though, because everything draws from
Warhammer is
else.
kind of another step of nerd below.
It is. You've gone below the surface when you get to Warcraft.
Right.
Yeah.
So for something like if we were doing space fantasy and I was doing a tier list, I'd probably put Warhammer 40K ahead of StarCraft because of the fact that 40K defined the Space Marine.
Yes.
Right? And so that's such an iconic part
I
of
don't know anything that's going on.
It's such an iconic part of space fantasy now that, okay, yes, I can trace this particular element back to this, and that's the influence. For Azeroth, it's less the particular elements and more the way that it gave all these various elements to a group of people.
Okay. Like, what are some things we could break out and say, like, Azeroth made this thing? Or not made, define this thing. Would we say things like, I'm trying to think, like, I guess maybe the way that, I guess sympathetic orcs would be one thing that I would kind of give them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think orcs up until that point have been portrayed very sympathetically. A little bit in Dungeons and Dragons, but I think early.
You can at least be a half orc.
Yeah, I don't even know if you could be a full orc in early D&D. That I would have to.
No. I do not believe so.
So yeah, sympathetic orcs would be part of it. Anything else that comes to your mind, or you're like
Murlocs come to mind. Now I have not played Warcraft, so it's hard for me to point to specific things within it, which is one of the limitations of my limited reference pool.
Yeah. I have an okay understanding, but it's all comes. The thing is, I haven't played World of Warcraft, which is where most Warcraft lore comes from, or the older games. I've played a lot of Hearthstone, which is like, it's in the universe, but it's a lot more, it's a card game. Come on, guys. The card game lore is a little bit more limited. But things like Death Knights, those are they're not taken up directly in other media, but they are pretty well defined. Like, there's an archetype and character design.
There's also, I would say there's a lot of iconic characters or
Yeah.
divisions or whatever you want to call it within that. Like, I know what a Space Marine looks like.
Yes.
I have not seen any gameplay of
Yes.
either World of Warcraft or Warhammer whatsoever, but I know what a Space Marine looks like.
Yeah.
And so I think like those kinds of things have permeated into the culture to an extent, even if it's kind of like, oh yeah, that's that nerd thing over there. You at least know about it. It's big. It's big enough that it's largely recognized.
Fair enough.
Like if
Even if my mom would have no idea what it is.
Right.
Right. Like if somebody's creating like an anthropomorphic panda species, I'm
Right,
going to
yeah.
assume they're inspired by the Pandaren from Warcraft.
Yeah.
Yeah. They did kind of nail that one. In a lot of ways, it does. They did also, like everyone else, copy D&D, but it's a video
Of
game.
course.
Yeah.
That's how it goes. Especially with WoW. Cool.
So what did you come up with as
So
number
here's
5?
the thing. Before I say my number 5, I just want to make sure. First of all, you guys, also the audience, are you guys sitting down?
Correct.
Making sure.
Yes.
I hope your heart rate's not elevated.
It is not
It's
currently,
okay.
but it might be depending on what you say.
My number 5, I'm going to put Lord of the Rings.
Fair enough.
It's all the way down number 5.
Okay.
Okay, defend that.
I was gonna say that one, Lord of the Rings. Initially, I like when I was doing my doing my list in pencil before we
Yep,
did it in
yep.
pen. I was just like, okay, Lord of the Rings is number 1.
Sure.
And it makes sense. Lord of the Rings is
Yep.
like the godfather of fantasy. I think what's it called? I don't think I've talked about it on this podcast. One of my favorite metaphors is from Terry Pratchett. Shout out to him.
Yeah.
Yep.
His setting, maybe it's on my list, maybe it's not. But he said that Lord of the Rings is basically the Mount Fuji of fantasy. It's
Yeah.
like, do you guys know the painting, The Great Wave?
Yes.
Yep.
I got Mount Fuji in the back.
Yes.
Now, I wish I knew the painter's name. I'm sorry.
don't.
He's a very famous Japanese painter. But that Great Wave is just the most popular in his series about Mount Fuji. And
Yeah.
all of them,
All of
Mount
it has
Fuji's
Mount
there.
Fuji in it.
Some of the times it's really close. Sometimes it's really far away, like in the Great Wave. It's just in the distance.
Yep.
Sometimes you can't even see Mount Fuji, but that's because it's being painted from the
From
perspective.
the top of
On Mount Fuji.
Yep.
Oh.
Lord of the Rings is the same way with
Yeah.
fantasy. There's a lot of people whose works are directly on Mount Fuji. They're basically built on Lord of the Rings. Sometimes people will intentionally distance themselves so they're not being seen as copies.
Yep.
It's a great work, and we get a ton of stuff from Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
The fantasy races are like the
Yeah.
main thing. Like the bog standard fantasy races basically come from Lord of the Rings. Now that's not 100% fair
Yeah.
because Lord of the Rings excludes a couple. Like I know there are technically goblins in Lord of the Rings.
Yep.
Yep.
But correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think there's actually a distinction between like goblins and orcs.
There is.
Besides like but is it? Wait, in what sense? Because I thought they were mostly used interchangeably. Like there's size differences, but
No, they're an entirely different race
Okay.
of people.
well, I'm wrong on that
Yeah.
one. Yeah, because I know goblins and orcs everywhere are considered very different.
Yeah.
Okay. No, but there's
They are different.
Okay, good. So basically all the fantasy races are covered outside of some of the ones that come up in like Warcraft.
Yeah.
Everyone has to say halfling because
Right. You can't say hobbit.
you can't say hobbit. You got problems. But this is all why Lord of the Rings is great and major. So why is it only number 5?
Yeah.
Is the
Why-
real
yeah.
question. There's like there's like 3 main reasons why it's only number 5 for
Sure.
me. Number 1 is because there's a thing higher on my list that I think is just, I think they get conflated a lot, but this
Sure.
one actually does a lot more of what people associate with Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
Okay.
But I don't want to spoil that one.
Fair enough.
2, this might be a hot take. I think that Lord of the Rings culturally is carried by the movies, and that if there
For
weren't
sure.
if there weren't for the movies, people actually wouldn't know very much about Lord of the Rings. It would be very much in the category of a lot of the other written works. And
Yep.
so in a lot of ways, I actually don't know how significant Lord of the Rings has been culturally outside of the fact that the movies brought us a lot of things that were huge like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And
Right.
modern fantasy is
Well, 20 years ago is when the movies came out.
well, what I'm getting at is that modern fantasy has kind of moved on.
Yeah.
It moved on writing wise a long time ago, and then even in like film and games,
Yep.
it's kind of moved on. A lot of the stuff that used to be, people used to copy Lord of the Rings, but a lot of that has been transferred over to Game of Thrones and beyond.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
yes,
So then to that, that's a fair point. But then I would bring the question of, it sort of did define fantasy for a good 30 to 50 years at least
Yeah.
after it came out. So
I'd
is
say
your
more than that, but Go ahead.
Okay, sure. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt
sure.
here.
Yeah.
So, is the fact that its influence has now decreased over time compared to later works the reason that it's not so high on the list? Is it a matter of recency rather than a matter of overall impact? Because the newer works, as influential as they are, have not had as much time to impact the fantasy genre that Lord of the Rings has been doing for almost a century.
I think that's mostly fair. It's just that we wouldn't actually give the benefit of the doubt to other older works in the same way.
Ah, okay.
Like,
fair.
Just because saying that the influence has waned over time, it's like, well, that's fair, but we have to look at it in 2024. You know,
Yeah.
it's like,
Sure.
I will say, so we haven't covered any of my honorable mentions so far, but some of them are on my honorable mention list because they are too young.
yeah,
Where I just go, we haven't had I don't know if what we're seeing right now is this explosion of, wow, this is super influential for 10 years.
that's kind of similar for mine. There's nothing on my list that's super young.
Yeah. And that's, spoiler alert, Middle Earth is on my list.
Well, yeah, I would hope so. I would hope Middle Earth's on your list.
And it's not my number 5.
I
guess I'll just save what I'm going to say until we get to that.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I don't. Yeah, the last point I would make is that I think that Middle Earth was extremely impactful on fantasy, but that in a lot of ways it was because fantasy was basically just Middle Earth.
Yeah.
Like the in the Mount Fuji painting metaphor, it's actually kind of in the distance now because that like standard style of fantasy is only a pillar. It's not even the core pillar anymore. In a lot of ways, we've kind of moved on from it. So it's not that it isn't impactful. It is. It's just that it's actually less. There are other things that are more impactful, I think, on the current genre of fantasy.
Sure.
Despite it on happiness list. On my personal enjoyment list. On my personal enjoyment list, it would be higher.
Yeah.
So do you have example of something that is perhaps slightly more influential than Middle Earth?
So
Something that might be, I don't know, at a good number 4 on a tier list.
at a good number 4 on a list, yes. I can take over and move up to my number 4. So my list is my own. It's not your guys' list. Lord of the Rings number 5.
That's true.
But there are some things on this that I would consider very much to be in fantasy, but they aren't even in necessarily standard fantasy.
Okay.
Number 4 on my list is Dragon Ball Z.
Okay.
Interesting.
I'm going to go ahead and mention one of my honorable mentions because I don't think it'll come up, but it's similar. I have Attack on Titan.
Yeah,
in that sense. That's also in my, it's too young to be included.
In
but
my
similar,
exactly, and close to my heart worlds would be high. I think it's very, very well done.
Yeah,
but no, I think Dragon Ball Z is just kind of way more influential than almost anything on an entire classification of fantasy.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
And it also for us is relevant because I know we just said most impactful in fantasy, but we're talking to the English speaking world.
Yes.
And so this is like the work that really introduced a whole classification of Eastern fantasy, which is huge now. And a lot of it is still impacted and influenced by Dragon Ball Z. There's also just a lot of things that have kind of gotten to the zeitgeist in general outside of just fantasy itself.
Yeah.
Like, for example, the concept of the hyperbolic time chamber is like almost, it's almost like common parlance. It's not even, it's very close to leaving any like even nerdiness. It's just,
I have never seen Dragon Ball Z, and I still use that phrase.
Exactly. It's like I don't even like Dragon Ball Z. It's kind of too old. It doesn't hold up.
It does not.
It does
really
not.
doesn't.
And in a lot of ways, it is also similar to something like Saturday morning cartoons or like comic books. But I still think it's pretty impactful on what fantasy is, and Eastern fantasy in general still kind of takes a lot away from it.
Yep.
So anyway, feel free to fire on me. It's okay. Go ahead.
I'm not going to fire on the pick. I think a lot of the things that you have brought up seem very, very similar to your take on Lord of the Rings, where it's just kind of like it's old and outdated. And so the only thing that I kick back on a little bit is like, well, I just think Lord of the Rings is better and less outdated than
Lord of the Rings is better. It's just that the big other reason I mentioned it, but the big reason why Lord of the Rings is number 5 is because there's a list thing that's higher.
That's fair.
I think is doing what Lord of the Rings is doing, and so it's like I can't put Lord of the Rings there because there's not another thing that I would put above Dragon Ball Z. There are others.
Sure.
There are other works that are similar. Like I think Astro Boy is the one people like to mention as like, oh, the first anime.
Sure.
But who's watched Astro Boy or knows anything about
Not I.
it? Exactly. It's a little bit, yeah. So
That being said, I don't know that I've watched a Dragon Ball Z episode all the way through. So
you would not be judged.
Thanks.
Having not seen Dragon Ball Z, are there
Yeah.
specific elements of the setting that you could say this has made its way into later works of media in the genre?
Elements of the setting, yeah. There's a lot of stuff in general. It's a lot of it is more thematic, although it is an element of the setting. Like the themes of like characters growing in power through adversity.
Okay.
Specifically, there being a well-defined. Well, it's not that well-defined in
Dragon Ball Z.
but a semi well-defined magic system for growing in power over time. That has been taken up by a lot of works.
Yeah.
The whole shonen genre, whatever. You could point to they're popular in the past. They're a little past their prime too, but like Naruto or One Piece or whatever.
Yeah.
Those were all pretty directly inspired by the way that fights and stuff work in Dragon Ball Z.
Yep.
Then even now, Attack on Titan, I wouldn't really consider to be inspired by it. But like Jujutsu Kaisen or whatever, which is popular now, has a lot of things it would take from it in terms of how the fights work and how.
Is Dragon Ball Z where the power level meme came from?
Yes.
It's over 9,000.
It's over 9,000. Again, like a well-defined power level.
Yes.
I could have a scanner to scan someone's level
power
of power,
level. Yeah.
which is silly, but it's
Quite.
But it's also been done to death 100 times. So that's why I would put Dragon Ball Z at number 4. And it doesn't get kind of. Again, I don't think that you can. I don't think there's another origin near its level of influence. There's like a couple things that almost were honorable mentions for me, like, but yeah, I don't think anything else takes its place. So that's why I put it number 4, even though Lord of the Rings is way better. It's not even like a contest in terms of actual quality, you know?
Sure.
Okay. Kevin,
Yes.
what is your number 4? Bring us back to reality.
All right. Well, I
Normal
can't because this is a fantasy podcast. So
Okay.
we're going to go with a fantasy setting, and that is going to be the Wizarding World of Harry Potter
Yes.
by J.K. Rowling.
Yes.
I don't think this is a particularly hot take to be on the list,
No.
but I'm going to explain my reasoning for it, having read, well, I'm halfway through the first book right now.
Okay.
It's a book.
It is a
decent.
book.
Yeah.
But even reading through it and having grown up in a society where that book was very popular for a time, or the series of books was very popular for a time, and in a way still is, that did it did a very strong job of defining what magic and witchcraft are to a certain group of people.
Okay.
And also
ahead.
it inspired a lot of fan fiction. And so because of the work that came out of it by other people, I give it its place on the list.
It's
Even-
very much. No, agreed. For me, Harry Potter was an honorable mention. I think it was
Same.
it was very close for me. But like the biggest boon to Harry Potter and the Wizarding World of Harry Potter is that the world has been the most enduring part of the series.
Yep.
Yes.
And like you said, fan work, like people, the amount of fan fiction, the amount of people, and the amount of things that still exist to this day in terms of like games and movies and stuff. Just because the books and people really wish they could go to Hogwarts.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, and a lot of things have endured from it in that way. You're fair.
Yeah. The reason that it's not on my list is I think the world building itself is surprisingly shallow.
Yes.
Like the world building of Hogwarts and the magic system is very deep, but the world building of the world is almost non-existent.
Anytime they leave Hogwarts, it's like the set is one. It's just cardboard cutouts stood up. It's like, okay, well, yeah, there would definitely be a school in America.
There's a school in France and there's a school in Russia, and we're not gonna like they'll show up for a competition and then they're gonna leave.
even like the whole sport of Quidditch, it's like, okay, well, this doesn't really make a lot of sense, but
See, I absolutely believe you. I just haven't gotten to that point. Like I've gotten to the point in the book where they've just explained the rules of Quidditch. They have not even played a game yet.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll say the reason why I put it as an honorable mention is that in general, it's been hugely impactful with people, but the actual particulars of Harry Potter have not really been picked up by almost anyone. Basically, the only part that has really been copied a lot is Magic School.
Yep.
And even that, like, School for Wizards,
Yeah.
actually less common than you think. They exist.
Okay.
There's plenty, but it's not as many as you would think. So I think it's super impactful on the genre. If we were doing like series, it would make my list. But for world, I'm like, it's very high thought-wise, but it doesn't personally make mine. Any other things about Harry Potter that really stuck out for you?
That was mostly it. I think I've said more or less my piece on it.
Okay.
It's if I had more to say, it would be above number 4.
That's fair.
Well, my number 4 is one of the things on my list that I have very, very little personal experience with. This is the world of Westeros.
That is for
Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire.
Got yes.
And I think just the fact that this like took over the cultural conversation for a number of years and really put not only just fantasy as a whole as like this is now like a legitimate art form that like adults can read and participate in, but also really put a more gritty, dark, realistic spin on fantasy that hadn't it existed prior but hadn't existed in like any sort of popular form.
Like even before the show came out, like in written fantasy, it really did have a massive impact on what was released for like the decade after it. What was desired was dark, gritty fantasy like world. Like, Game of Thrones. For some reason, I want to say Wheel of Time. I like Game of Thrones. Yes.
I think, and the fact that the show itself has pushed the other major streaming platforms to have to come up with their own like fantasy series to have, which personal opinions on that. Having not seen Game of Thrones or whatever the spinoff is, I still don't think like anybody else has done as good of a job at it. And that's like I can't say a whole lot more to it because I don't have in-depth knowledge on the world itself, but like I know a lot about the world just because of conversations that coworkers had at work and and just it being within the popular zeitgeist of at least here in America. It was huge.
Yes. For me, I put it down as an honorable mention because I believe everything that you say about it, but I've never read anything in the Westeros universe, and I've never read or watched anything that I could say, oh, this is very clearly inspired by this. So I'm certain that it's out there, but because I don't have any personal experience with it, I couldn't actually put it on the list.
For me, this one was like inches away. I don't think it would be number 6 for me. But it was close. I agree. There were 2 things that personally kept it off my list. Well, 2.5. One, I actually put audience enjoyment, like popularity is lower on my criteria. It's one of my criteria, but it's like the least important one. But the other thing is that Game of Thrones, I think it was more of it was a little bit more, not a flash in the pan, but the long-term reach of it, I think, is shorter than we would think. Like, it's already kind of lost its golden boy status from when the show came out.
Well, except for that they have a spinoff that is also doing very, very well right now.
What is the spinoff?
I don't remember.
It's like House of Dragons, I think.
Okay.
But even then, like the second season, it actually kind of fallen off in terms of viewership. Like, and the other thing is that dark, gritty fantasy is actually kind of going out of style. It's been going out of style for like the last 5 years.
Thank goodness for that. I keep your nihilism out of my fantasy.
Right. I'm cool. Yeah, I'm cool.
I love it in my sci-fi. That's totally fine, but just keep it out.
I think there's great grim dark fantasy. Some like it would never make the list, but like the Blade itself, what's it called? First Law, quite good. But for the most part, it's actually there's not that many things still coming from it. So I think it's close. It's big, but it's less enduring than I was expecting.
Fair enough.
The other thing I would say is that I think Game of Thrones is more stylistically impactful than it is a hugely impactful world. Because from Westeros, there's not really much that's new. There is some. Like,
Yeah.
I think the seasons are very interesting. And
Yes.
that is something that has been picked up elsewhere.
Sure.
But outside of that, it's mostly just that it's dark and fancy.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to put that down as world because it's like, well,
I
this
would
is
still
more-
include it in the
It is kind of
world.
like, kind of setting.
You're
Yeah, yeah.
either way. I'm not going to argue
Yeah.
hardcore for it. I think it is included within.
Yeah,
It's included within the rules of the world,
that's fair.
which I would include in just kind of in the world building idea of like, is this a world where good persists because it is good,
Yes.
or is this a world where just stuff happens?
And this is you're like the king of stuff happens.
This is the king of stuff happens.
That's fair.
Yep.
Yeah,
Now, so that was your number 4.
that was my number 4.
You're saying still more impactful than D&D.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think,
Yeah.
this one kind of it's on that bubble of based on how long it's been out, and how the popularity of it remains. I think, like you're saying, I think there is a reasonable chance that we do see it fall off. I don't think it will ever become I think it will be kind of caveat that he finishes it. I think it will be kind of a common staple of like the fantasy genre.
Agreed.
It will be in these sorts of conversations for a really long time.
Yeah.
Will it be in the overall like popular eye? I don't know.
That's fair.
So
Okay.
we'll see.
Number 4 for you, Westeros, Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Let's go to number 3. Kevin,
Yeah.
what is your third number thing?
All right, number 3. So I'm going with Robert E. Howard's The Hyborian Age. So
Okay.
this is the setting of Conan the Barbarian.
Yep.
That was an honorable mention for me. Go Conan. Now, what do you got for us on Conan? Why is Conan number 3?
Why is Conan number 3? Well, one is its longevity.
Yeah, fair enough.
It predates Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And so not obviously being old isn't enough, but it's that it's old and still has influence on works written today.
Okay.
Having not exhaustively read books in the series, but having read some of it, one of the things that jumps out to me as its contribution is the
Sexism.
also also the morally questionable. If you want a fantasy culture, you take a real culture, change the name slightly, and file the serial numbers off. And
Yeah.
hey, it's now original and
Yeah.
totally not offensive.
Not at all.
Well, it's not. We're not talking about those guys over there. We're talking about the insert random name people.
Yeah.
Come
Yes.
on.
That have all of the racial stereotypes of those people, but they're
It's
not,
not the
those
same
people.
thing.
Except for, when they don't even bother to change the name.
There
Well,
we go.
there's that.
What are some things that you think have persisted from Conan? Because my issue, like I liked Conan as an option on the list, but I'm like, I can't find enough that feels like it is
That was the same for me.
directly inspired.
Yeah.
But what are the sorts of things you think that have really carried throughout? I don't know how old is Conan? Do you know? Is it like are we at 100 years old or?
I believe they were written in the 30s
Okay.
at the
So
earliest.
close.
So close.
We're close, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what has lived 80, 90 years?
Sure. So off the top of my head, this is more a function of the story than the setting.
Yeah.
It's sort of the white male action hero who goes around and slays all the things and is basically the
Yeah.
the male equivalent of
self-insert.
a Mary Sue in fantasy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah,
not
like that
that's-
sort of like macho self-insert
Yes.
fantasy protag. I think of all the old fantasy books you'll see of like muscular guy, sweaty
Exactly.
guy. I guess some of those are just romance novels, but yeah, muscular guy with a sword fantasy, Conan.
Sure. The other thing is the sort of like the campaigning errant knight theme that then influenced a lot of like chainmail and D&D, which then influences anything that comes out of that,
Okay,
Sure.
yeah.
right? And then, as mentioned before, the way that it constructs its setting by taking things that are very obviously this is real life, but we tweaked it very slightly.
Right.
And people still continue to do that today. And even though there's a lot more effort into respecting the original culture that you're actually, being inspired by.
Yeah.
But that is, in my estimation, a refinement and improvement on the concept that is originally being done, which is rather than I'm going to construct this society all from scratch, like, say, Tolkien's elves. And so now, in order to understand how they think, you have to go and, look at the way that their language has morphologically changed over time or whatever.
Yeah.
You could just say, oh, it's like this country over there, except maybe with these couple of tweaks.
Yeah.
I got it.
Right.
I think also just its staying power, like the fact that Conan is still, to an extent, culturally relevant almost 100 years later says something.
Almost everything else from that era is completely lost.
Yeah.
Not lost to time, like we have it written down somewhere, but it has no cultural relevance.
And obviously, like, it's been adapted for time, which is good.
It got brought forward to be a little bit more palatable.
Yeah. But I think the fact that, like, Conan was still, like, there were Saturday morning Conan the Barbarian cartoons.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Oh,
were you
No.
a cartoon enjoyer?
I was
or no?
I was not
I didn't
allowed
watch
to
cartoons,
be,
but I knew that.
I was not allowed to be much of a Saturday morning cartoon enjoyer growing up.
Okay.
So there's
we
this
didn't have a
section of-
TV growing up, so I wasn't either.
You had it worse than I did.
Right. But I've heard of it,
Yeah.
I've heard of that part. The only other thing I'd say is it makes sense, but in a lot of ways it seems like from your criteria you would put Harry Potter higher. Now, because I don't think staying power necessarily wasn't part of your criteria, right?
It wasn't, but I was putting down influence as my criteria, and so it's had more time to be influential.
Okay.
Right? And so being influential over a period of 70 to 90 years
Sure.
Yeah.
is you can put a lot more influence out than something that's only been out for 20.
That's fair. Although on the flip side, you could also argue that something that's younger having a high level of influence is more impressive. That but we don't know 100% if it's going to exist.
Yeah,
on
we
a
don't know.
timescale.
Yeah.
Because
Sure.
like maybe in 20 years Harry Potter's completely out of style and
Yeah.
no one is interested, but there's a chance that it continues on and then in 80 years it will be the really old story.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, makes sense. Conan the Barbarian. What was the name of the setting? Because I've only heard
The Hyborian Age,
Hyborian Age. There we
which I believe the continent is called Hyboria, but that's not the name of the setting itself.
go. Okay,
Gotcha.
makes sense. Okay, so that's your number 3. I guess I can do my number 3 here.
What do you have?
So my number 3 is definitely the most niche of the ones that I picked.
Okay.
This is the one where it's least popular. It's not
Interesting.
unpopular,
Okay.
but I think it's had a massive impact on the setting. This is the one that for me kind of took Harry Potter's slot.
Okay.
This is the Wizard of Earthsea in the Earthsea setting.
Okay.
Because in
Fair
a lot
enough.
of ways, it's just Harry Potter but older.
Yeah.
It was the first major magical school where a
Yep.
kid went to learn to become a wizard.
Yep.
And he was chosen and did special things.
Yeah.
It's very much that. It
Okay.
is.
Yeah.
It is.
It's very Harry Potter.
It's very Harry Potter. Although it's like Harry Potter, but not. I think it's technically children's, but it's a lot harder to parse than Harry Potter.
Sure.
So the real question would be, why would this be over Harry Potter if
That's
it's
my
not
question.
very popular? So the reason why I'm putting it higher is that, for one thing, it has kind of put a lot more things into the cultural consciousness of fantasy in ways that you wouldn't necessarily know. Like, this is the biggest story to talk about, like, naming magic.
Yep.
About the power of words.
Yeah.
And that names have meaning. I know, but I think that's like actual real world occult teaching.
Yeah. True naming is
Yeah.
yeah.
But
That was way back.
that's older, but that's a little different, But in terms of fantasy,
My number 3, the occult.
right? It's also why, you mentioned earlier why I'm not going to put down Greek mythology.
Yeah.
Right.
But so things like true naming and even just a lot of the ways that magic is practiced is a lot more tied to Earthsea than it is to Harry Potter or to a lot of other things. The other big thing is that it's much more revered by writers than a lot of
Yes.
Harry Potter, a lot of other things. There are a lot of writers that directly cite Ursula, I think it's Le Guin. I'm not good at pronouncing her name, but they cite her as a major influence and as someone who's very important to them. There's a lot of people who just copied her, like Harry Potter. I can't see any. Yeah. I don't think that Rowling has ever mentioned Earthsea, even though she clearly read the book, because there's a lot of things that are just cribbed directly from. So I think that it's a lot more relevant in that way. The other thing is, I don't remember if I mentioned this during when you brought up Harry Potter. Harry Potter's magic system itself is not actually very relevant to the genre. No one really copies Harry Potter's magic or or much to do with the way that the magic system works. The Harry Potter magic system in general is not super well.
No, it's very shallow.
It's very shallow.
Just there are spells.
There are spells, and it's not like Wizard of Earthsea is like Stormlight or something where they spend a lot of time listing all the powers. But in a lot of ways, I think it's a lot more influential in terms of things that actually get picked up later, the consequences of magic and stuff. In that way, I think it's a lot more impactful on the genre, and it's one of those like cornerstone ones that I can't find a good replacement for. Yeah, and so it would make the list.
Fair enough.
And again,
I like Wizard of Earthsea better than Harry Potter, having read both. Yeah. Not all of both, but having read a decent amount of both. I like it better. I just think as far as impact goes, I do have to give the nod to Harry Potter.
That I can see it. It's again, this one is the one where I'm like the most, not most unsure of. It's like
I don't disagree with your reasoning. I just with my own logic, I just think I think Harry Potter will endure the test of time, and I don't know that Wizard of Earthsea will.
I guess that depends. Part of that comes down to like, okay, if we're talking world impact, the impact of the world. Part of the issue I have with the impact of Harry Potter going forward versus something like Earthsea is that Harry Potter, the actual writing is not as sharp.
No.
Sure. It's a children's novel, but they're both children's novels. Yeah. Le Guin is has very high prose, and it makes sense. She's a very classically trained poet. Makes sense. Yeah. I think that there's a lot of high chance that Earthsea will live longer just because it's significantly better written, and eventually. But we just don't have enough time to tell for sure. Yeah. Like Harry Potter is what, like 30 years old almost?
Something like that.
So it's like 20, 30 years old. I think it was in the 19...
Was it? No, 90s? I think it was early 2000s, so it might be only 20.
It might be only 20, but it's like 20, 30 years old. We'll see. It's just too young because Harry Potter spawned a lot of children's and YA writing that I don't know if it's going to last forever or if it's going to be fine. Yeah. I would wager that Earthsea is going to live longer. Yeah. But we will see.
Well, Earthsea has been around for much longer, right?
It has been around for much longer.
So it already has that going for it. Yep. Yeah. I haven't read it. When I was doing my research for this episode, that name was coming up, and I'm like, I have not gotten around to reading this yet.
Good.
It is very much like that. Before I had read it, I didn't think as much of it, but then I was like, in terms of impact, but then after having read it, I'm like, oh, actually... Like when there's just so many ideas that just float around in terms of fantasy.
Yeah.
Yep. And again, the thing that supersedes is Lord of the Rings. I feel like it's because of that. It's like it just puts a lot in the air.
Yeah.
I think Earthsea has put a lot in the air.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I go back and read it, then it could very well displace Harry Potter from this list.
That's fair. It'll feel familiar regardless if you read it.
Yeah.
Good to know.
All right, Braylon, you're the only one I think who hasn't given your number 3.
I have not. And I also realized that when I said earlier that everything else was books, I just didn't read my number 3. Not sure why. But going from the gritty, dark world of Westeros, we're now going to transition to, and this is like loosely a world, Studio Ghibli, which I am just including as a world.
Okay.
Sure.
Give your reasoning.
And I'm defining world more loosely. I'm not defining world as here's a map that has all of these different spaces on it, but they all fit into the same. I don't want to say style because it's more than style.
You didn't want to say it because that's what it is, Braylon.
It's okay. That's fair. It's more than that. I think it is more than that. But I think the aesthetic of it and the sort of, it's almost a return to fairy stories
Okay.
And kind of where they all kind of fit in the same world.
Yeah.
Like you could imagine that there could be overlap, even though like we know that there's not, as you know, some of the stories are very much based in real life events, and
right?
Some of them are not. I don't.
So it's like Studio Ghibli is a weird one where that one didn't even make it on my list.
That's fair enough.
Which is a clever one. It's for one thing.
I will say like my own enjoyment of it definitely elevates it.
Wow.
It probably should be number 5. Well, it probably should be number 4.
That's crazy.
That's crazy. But I just have I had Westeros at number 3 and this is number 4, and I was just like, I'm not morally okay with that.
Okay, so I can see that.
So take my arguments as though it's number 4, which still is like maybe it doesn't belong on the list.
I was gonna say the thing is, it's like Studio Ghibli. I feel like most of the Ghibli like innovations and the things that the enduring legacy of it is not just stylistically in terms of like the style of the writing or style of the stories or anything, but just like the art style and the whimsy that it portrays.
Which I would include in world building for any visual medium. Okay. Is also like, how is your world depicted?
Okay.
Sure. I would include that in writing as well. It's different in prose versus here it is visually represented to you.
I guess I can see that. Yeah.
But I think it still is a part of that world building aesthetic.
Yeah.
Yeah, the tone of a setting is certainly a part of the setting itself.
Yeah.
Okay. That's fair. Like, what are some things that you would look at as Ghibli and say, Studio Ghibli, and say this has truly impacted? In this case, maybe it's even what movies you think.
Oh, yeah, sure. I think a lot of it is just kind of introducing that form of media to the Western world.
Okay.
I think that has had a pretty significant impact, and we see other sort of spin-offs that have taken place, some of them better than others. Mm-hmm. But that sort of cozy feel to it. There were a couple other that kind of fit into this slot that I almost included and have kind of put them in another spot that we'll get to that you'll also probably push back against for probably the same reason that you're pushing back against this. But
if you put Pixar movies at number 1, we'll see.
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
No, it's not that bad. No, but I think the aesthetic of it, both visually and also I would say emotionally, just like that sort of like very cozy fantasy, which didn't really, and again we'll get into this later, but didn't really exist on the level that it exists within the Western conscious prior to this.
That's kind of fair. Even some of the older Western animated films that are fantastical are a lot more somber than you would think. Yeah. Like Snow White is a pretty somber movie compared to something like Tangled or any of the... Yeah. I mean, that's more adventurous too, but like it's fair that like more cozy stories, softer edges, that is kind of a Ghibli legacy.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't have anything to say to that because I've not seen a single Studio Ghibli anything.
Gosh, no!
It's been too long. There's so many that I need to see, but I just haven't gone back to watch them all. But yeah, they are good. I remember loving them as a kid too.
Yep.
That's just how it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're almost all at least good.
Okay.
There's a certain level.
List.
Yeah.
Some of them are phenomenal, and some of them are okay.
All right, so we're at number 2.
Correct.
What do you have?
My number 2. Now, this one I think is the one that might get the most pushback, not in terms of placement, but qualification.
Okay.
But I'm willing to fight for it.
All right.
Marvel is what I put at number 2.
Okay. That is on my honorable mentions.
Okay, because I think Marvel ultimately is just fantasy.
Yeah.
But then sometimes it gets put... I mean, it's just medium that really separates it for the most part.
Now, when you say Marvel, you're not referring specifically to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but the entire body of the Marvel canon.
I am.
Up to this point.
I am. I would attribute it mostly, honestly, to like, if I had to be specific, I would say like Spider-Man.
Sure.
Maybe the Avengers, although the Avengers are a more recent addition. Because the big thing is that Marvel has just been massively impactful way before the MCU even came out. The idea of a superhero and this entire genre of fiction that goes towards superheroes and heroics. There was Marvel and DC, but Marvel is a little bit more impactful in my mind.
So DC is not on my honorable mentions. Yes. Marvel is, and the reason is DC feels more sci-fi.
Ooh, that's fair. I think
a lot of DC's powers come from like, alien, tech, that sort of thing where a lot of the not all. Like there's definitely sci-fi within Marvel.
I was going to say, because even like early Marvel is, you could honestly kind of class early Marvel. If you really wanted to, you class early Marvel as sci-fi because it's like, well, a radioactive spider.
Yeah.
And
but even
gamma
that
waves
is very fantasy.
It is.
Yeah. That's almost more fantasy than sci-fi. Like it's that vaguity.
I do hear you because I do think that DC has more vibes that go towards sci-fi.
Yeah.
Rather than Marvel, which has gone towards fantasy. I mean, there's also just like a lot more magic in Marvel.
Yeah.
Directly.
Yep.
There's magic in DC. I know.
Yeah.
But I think, and it also just in terms of impact, Marvel has been more impactful than DC.
True.
Superman and Batman have been super impactful.
Yeah.
But besides that, it's
DC as a whole, not so much.
And also, again, specifically Spider-Man, and now more recently the Avengers.
Yep.
I think they've done a lot. There's a lot of things in terms of like worldwide influence. There's a lot of secondary and tertiary effects of Marvel and of comic book style of storytelling that has been massively impactful. And then in general, just like the setting details and the magic system of Marvel, I think is super pervasive.
Sure.
Even just like the other big thing is like superhero world logic.
Mm-hmm.
Like the idea of vigilantes and the way that supervillains exist. These sorts of things have been super impactful, and it's older. So
for me, Marvel does a better job of actually defining the setting than DC does. And for my experience, that comes mostly from the MCU, but it does actually explore questions of, we have superheroes. How does society deal with this?
Yes.
Right? Or superheroes do things and they impact the world. How do people feel about this? And it actually feels more like a world in which you could exist, whereas DC is, I have these characters, but I don't want to live in Gotham.
Exactly. No one wants to live in Gotham.
No one wants to live in Gotham.
No, I do think that the MCU is like the biggest proof of concept that the Marvel world is so impactful.
Yeah.
Because the MCU is not very original. They just took a lot of the old Marvel stories and put them in movies. And people loved it. And people really want to be in the MCU and they just love the world itself. That's what sold so many of the movies. I know there was like 0% chance I would have watched the Guardians of the Galaxy if it weren't for the MCU. Great movie. But I wasn't interested. But then you look at some of the settings even in that where you're like the idea of like, I think that like the thing it's a very small thing, but like in Guardians of the Galaxy world building, I think my favorite setting is Nowhere. The idea of like the head of it, it's like the head of a god, of an old god, dead old god.
That's just fun.
Nowhere. It's very interesting. Like there's a lot of interesting things there. So that's why I think Marvel's number 2. It's like right there. It can't really justify it number 1 because it is massively impactful.
Yeah.
But it mostly stays within like the world of superheroes.
Yep.
And then beyond superheroes, even just into like heroic fantasy. Whereas there's just so much else in the genre.
That's ultimately why I didn't make my list, is that it was like it's just not fantasy enough to not put it on the list.
That's fair. It's like, and there's not a ton of crossover between this and Sword and Sorcery.
Right.
There's really
not.
Either way, even magic in Marvel, magical characters kind of
feels very different.
But it feels very different. Doctor Strange is not gonna make sense.
Yeah, he doesn't feel like a wizard.
No.
Yeah.
No, not really.
He's a superhero wizard. That's all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You give him a pointy hat, he'll feel more like one.
Sure.
That's fair.
Speaking of pointy hats, my number 2 is Middle Earth.
Okay, there we go.
I can't believe you put down Middle Earth.
Yeah, I mean, it is everything that we discussed earlier. I think its staying power is more significant than maybe you think
fair.
it is.
I
I think also even outside of Middle Earth by itself being still super pervasive, I think there are a number of things that Tolkien did that are still very, very pervasive, even as like fantasy is moving away from that, including like the races obviously is the big one, but also just like the massive amount of lore that he has. That's a big thing right now in terms of like how much lore your world has to have, creating new languages. I mean, having a map at the beginning of your book.
To be fair, like to be entirely fair, you could call Tolkien like the father of world building.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's really accurate. There are people before him, but that idea of world building, which is now a core of, I mean, we're doing a podcast about it, but it's like it's a pillar of what makes sci-fi and fantasy.
Yeah.
Yes.
He did in a lot of ways kind of come up with it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of what he did is still very, very pervasive, even as we're like fantasy is trying to move away from like the very defined good, evil, sort of thing. Of even just stuff like the orcs are evil. There is no redeeming an orc. They're just bad. Like there's no hope for an orc.
So what you're saying is that he was racist.
Well, if you no. If you read through the Silmarillion, it's different.
I was gonna say, what the people from the east are bad guys.
Well, there is
know,
that.
So,
that is a little bit rough.
You know, just saying.
Yeah. It's a little rough.
It's not Conan. But,
no, it's not Conan.
You gotta actually like look between the lines.
Yeah.
No.
Although if the highest praise you can give for something's moral uprightness is it's not Conan.
Well, no, I could go into plenty more of Tolkien's moral uprightness.
No, I mean, Lord of the Rings, yes, it's goated. Everybody knows it's up there. Like Again, if we talk best series, it's clearly on Mount Rushmore, maybe number one. I don't know.
Yeah.
The
so
settings
I don't need to wax long about it. I think everybody kind of gets why it's here.
Yeah, it's entirely fair. So for me, number 2, so I'm going to wheel back around because you said D&D and I'm like, you can't do that because it's not a well-defined setting. So I'm going to choose a well-defined setting from D&D. And so I'm taking Ed Greenwood's Forgotten Realms setting.
Okay.
Yes. So basically D&D. Yeah.
Right. So basically D&D, but actually has like, this has the named locations that you might recognize.
Sure.
Like, okay, here's the Sword Coast and here's... Here's my favorite
the ones
location.
you might recognize. This one and these other ones I can't remember.
No. So it's I want to give some preface to this. It's my favorite location in all of any fantasy thing. In terms of naming, is the Barge Right Inn.
Okay.
Because I love the pun and the fact that it also fits so well. It's like, I mean, it's Barge Right is totally a thing that you would name an inn.
Yes.
But then it also comes into the fun. I'm like, okay, that's brilliant. I love that so much. Mm-hmm. He also sort of like the Forgotten Realm setting pioneered sort of like the Drown, like the dark elf depiction.
That's fair.
And so for that, it's okay if you have dark elves, they're probably going to be at least inspired by this in some way, even if, again, you don't want to take off like these sexist overtones and port those over. And then you also have, that is the setting for Salvatore's writings, which is sort of like the popular D&D novel list.
Oh, okay.
And
I haven't read any of that.
Neither have I, but I've heard the name enough to know that, okay, this has had a continuing impact, and he's not the original designer of the setting. So it's not just, you're writing more stuff in your own setting. It's, this setting is good enough that somebody else is willing to play in your sandbox.
Yes.
And then from there, you have people who play D&D and read these. They're going to be drawing from that in works that they produce subsequently.
Yeah. No, I think it's fair. I think it totally deserves the placement. Forgotten Realms, I'm like, I get the distinction, although I'm like, in Forgotten Realms, my issue with it is just that it still feels like, if we're talking locations and things of that nature, it's not that popular. Like, it's not that influential. But to be fair, most physical locations are not that influential for the top worlds in fantasy. It's kind of not how it works. They exist. Hogwarts by itself. Yep. But most places are not as realized or as interesting as Hogwarts to people.
Yeah.
So that's where
there are plenty that are iconic, but not that in depth.
Yeah.
So,
but
similar.
as far as like the world itself goes, yeah, definitely deserves
Right.
it.
Yeah.
The other thing about choosing a location to be iconic from an RPG setting is that a lot of the iconicness of it is from the times that you were playing in that setting. And so I can think back to a D&D campaign that I was in that was set in Forgotten Realms. That's like, oh yeah, we were in this town and went to this bridge.
Yeah.
But if you haven't actually experienced that setting, you're not going to understand those locations.
Yeah.
And if you were playing it in a different campaign, you might have had a different description or a different interaction with it. And so it's okay, well, I remember this because our party, got
Did
into a
this
very
there.
important
Yeah,
fight
yeah.
here.
Yeah. That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Now,
Honorable mentions.
we're on to honorable mentions. Let's keep it brief because we got places to be. In the world. No. I think we mentioned a lot of them. I'm going to throw out one right here.
Okay.
I love this series. I had to put Narnia as an honorable mention.
I also have Narnia as an honorable mention.
It's like 6 or 7 for me on the list. There's not as much that persists from Narnia specifically as a lot of other settings. It is the inventor of Portal Fantasy, or not the inventor, but the
popularizer of
Portal Fantasy, which is still pretty relevant.
Yep.
But that's the main thing that I would take away from it. It's even funny because like the fantasy races from Narnia are not as pervasive as like Lord of the Rings.
No.
Like, fawns exist.
Yeah.
They're not, but also the depiction of fawns hasn't persisted as much. A lot of the current depiction of fawns comes more from Greek mythology than it does from Narnia.
Yep.
That's why it's not on my list.
Yep.
As much as I
No,
love
it's
Narnia.
it's an honorable mention of mine as well.
It actually, it runs into this fairly strange spot as I can see this as a place that a lot of people like think of the Narnia setting fondly, but I can't draw a line from it to anything after it.
Yeah.
Like it's super impactful in terms of writing style, super impactful in terms of children's fiction.
Yep.
But specifically fantasy world,
Yeah.
it's like I don't see it as much.
Yep. Yep.
Plus, Narnia's world is a little less defined.
Yeah.
It feels like there are very distinct settings within Narnia for each book.
Yep.
That don't overlap very much.
Yep.
Not a whole lot. A lot of them are very different.
Some do, of course. Like The Horse and His Boy and The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe are like the same setting. Prince Caspian, pretty similar setting.
Yeah.
But
I mean, Voyage of the Ton Treader, to be fair, is sort of explicitly about we're going to the fringes of the setting.
yeah, we're going away. And the last battle is like a different thing.
Yes. Yeah. Same as Silverchair.
Same as Silverchair. Great book.
Very different.
Very different setting. Any other? Someone else want to throw out an honorable mention?
So I had Narnia. I also had. I have the Cosmere as an honorable mention. I think it has the potential to
It's just too
be,
young.
but it's way too young.
It's too young.
Yep.
I also have Stranger Things as too young, but I think we have already seen some of its social impact, and I think we could continue.
It's true. Stranger Things is also a weird one because it's also kind of horror-ish,
Yeah,
and so it's like,
but it's like
blending
it's
the
kind of
lines.
fantasy horror.
It is, yeah.
What else? I have Wheel of Time, which is here because I have not read any of it.
I mean, Wheel of Time is. I like Wheel of Time, but it's not nearly as impactful as a lot of these things. A lot of people love Robert Jordan, but like, it feels like Lord of the Rings, but more modern.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've read one of the books in the Wheel of Time series, and
Okay.
yeah, it's good. Mm-hmm. But it's hard for me to say, oh yeah, this is a revolutionary on the face of fantasy.
There are some things that it does really nail and that have been popularized elsewhere. Like it's that quintessential farm boy story, for example. But I agree. It was just an honorable mention for me. It didn't make it all the way.
Yep. So I have a couple of honorable mentions that haven't been covered here. One is George Romero's Night of the Living Dead.
Okay.
Because, so here's the thing. It's not really fantasy.
Yeah.
But it defined the zombie.
True.
Which then makes it into D&D and any other fantasy that now deals with the undead. If you want a corpse that shambles towards you and wants to eat your brains,
that's a zombie.
you're drawing it from that. And so that has a massive influence. It sort of loses points on the, but it's not really fantasy in and of itself. It's just been ported over.
That's true. It itself is really horror. That's what it is. But
right. And then Another one. So this one gets major points for longevity is Dante. I'm going to mispronounce this. Dante Alighieri's Hell.
Yeah.
From Inferno.
Yeah. The Inferno. Right. What's it called? Is it Divine Comedy?
The Divine Comedy, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. But everybody's only ever read Inferno, so that's
exactly.
why.
Well, exactly. But I thought usually people referred to it as the Divine Comedy.
It is the Divine Comedy, but in terms of like what everybody has
but the
read,
Inferno is what people
they've only read the one book in it,
which is a shame because the other ones are better.
But it is true. But Dante's Inferno,
right?
Yeah.
And so for me, that comes down to, well, you basically have now defined hell for the next several centuries in fantasy. And so, like, that's majorly influential.
Yes.
It's just also, it's like it's dancing the lines of fantasy, but that's,
right.
It's fair.
Yep. The last one that I have, the last serious one that I have a couple in there that are mostly just in there for me. That if anybody mentioned it, I'd be like, yeah, I like that too. But the last one that I seriously considered is Beowulf. And that's kind of like right there at the cusp of what you were talking about between mythology and fantasy. Yeah. And it's kind of like right on that line.
Exactly.
And ultimately, I did tip it a little bit more into the mythology, which is why it didn't make my list.
That's why, the last one for me would be like, I put it as like, this could be number 6, but probably not on the list, was like Greek mythology, specifically Homer's works.
Yep. I didn't even consider those.
The problem is it's just it's almost that they're too influential in the genre. Like,
they're too influential as just written works.
Yes. So it's like, but there's like too many specifics that get taken, and there's a lot of works of fantasy today that are just set in the world of Greek mythology, but it's also not as defined in terms of who created it. It's like, okay, well, there's Homer's works and there's other works and just general mythology, and obviously the original 10, like you mentioned. So it doesn't really count, but it's also like really influential on current fantasy.
Yeah.
So cool. Yeah, there's some other things I had that are like things I like, but they didn't merit an honorable mention.
Yep, same.
Yep.
So let's recap our list so far. At number 5, I had Lord of the Rings. Number 4, I put Dragon Ball Z. Number 3, I put The Wizardversity. And number 2, I put Marvel.
Yep. So for me, I put down Azeroth by Blizzard as number 5. Number 4 is The Wizarding World of Harry Potter, or Harry Potter if you just want to be succinct, by Rowling. The Hyborian Age by Howard as number 3. Number 2 is Forgotten Realms by Ed Greenwood.
All right. I had just kind of D&D as a whole as my number 5, then Westeros, Studio Ghibli, and then Middle Earth.
All right.
And if your number 1 isn't Middle Earth, I'm going to be a little bit disappointed.
Kevin, you start us off.
I'll start you off. My number 1 is Tolkien's Legendarium. You knew it was going to be on there.
You didn't mention it yet, and you can't leave it off even honorable mention.
That's what I was like.
If
it's not in your top 5 and you didn't mention it, it's an honorable mention.
No, it's like number 15. It's like, what the heck? Yeah.
So I could give you the reasons on this list, but you know them already because we've discussed it like 2 times already in the podcast.
It's just good.
It's good, and for me, it's like you said, it's the Pratchett Mount Fuji thing of. It's many things you can draw a line from this back to this.
Yes.
Yep.
Was it entirely original? No, it very clearly took inspiration from a bunch of sources before it. But the way that it combined them into something new, and then that new thing became the cornerstone for everything that derived from it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Like the genre would not be what it is today if that work did not exist.
Yeah. No. This genre needed Tolkien. In a lot of ways, it is considered the beginning of fantasy.
Yep. And we probably should have ended with yours because yours is probably the least controversial. It's
very not controversial,
but it's fine because we can just like move past them. Yeah. I guess I can go. So my number 1 is the reason why Lord of the Rings is number 5.
Very curious what this is.
But it's also not new to list. I put D&D at number 1.
Okay.
Because here's the thing. I think that D&D has superseded Lord of the Rings as the stock fantasy template. Like when people imagine fantasy, they're imagining D&D. They're not really imagining Middle Earth anymore.
Okay.
Even like the way that you look at the races. Again, like fantasy races a lot of them were created by Lord of the Rings, but these days people think of it in terms of Dungeons and Dragons races. Mm-hmm. Especially in the ways that something like dragons are handled.
Yep.
There's basically Dungeons and Dragons is less that has less clear morals than Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons, like gameplay and also people find dragons cool. And so in a lot of ways, it's like, yeah, the way that you think of these races, you're auto-completing to Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
The way that you think of a lot of Magic, you're auto-completing to Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think it's the most impactful, because it is the template. This is what everyone else takes from. And it doesn't have as much, it also doesn't have as many stylistic limitations as Lord of the Rings.
Sure.
Lord of the Rings is hard to read for a lot of modern audiences.
That is fair.
It is. It's very dense.
Yep.
There's a lot of description.
Yep.
Now, you can kind of get over this with the movies, but the movies are also, they're not young anymore. No. And this is not a slight on the movies. It's just that they, over time, like a movie loses some relevance.
Yes.
Whereas Dungeons and Dragons feels like it's honestly just getting started. Like we've had a new...
Yeah.
I'm shocked that we're having a new age of D&D with very little changes to the actual world itself or to even like the gameplay version of the set.
Yeah.
Now, I think that Lost Worlds would be fair as far as the setting goes. I just think that the least relevant part of Dungeons and Dragons in general are like physical locations and like deities.
Sure.
Besides that, everything else is pretty cleanly defined, and it's stuff that people just take around. And just the idea of like adventuring and heroes, it's kind of just D&D.
Yeah.
So that's why personally...
No, I think that's a very fair pick. I think for me personally, like I didn't put it any higher than I did because it is a world that you take and make something else.
Yes.
And there are some definitions, and the other thing is, I think right now we're seeing a D&D renaissance, but really we're seeing a tabletop RPG renaissance.
Yes.
That D&D just is still currently the big name in TTRPGs, but I don't think it's as exclusive to that. I mean, even like the big places that we're seeing D&D being used are not in D&D. Like Critical Role is not, I mean, it's D&D the system, but it's not the D&D world. Right. And a lot of it is stuff that they've taken and made their own homebrew stuff.
It's, I think you're fair. It's just
I don't disagree with your...
No, you're fair. I think it's fair. I think the important stuff is defined enough.
Yeah.
And that stuff doesn't get changed very much.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, yeah, like I have a hard time. I can't really disagree with you because I put a D&D setting as number 2.
Yeah.
And part of the reason that I phrased like that I picked a specific setting out of D&D was because of the original criteria that I had.
Exactly.
Whereas once you say, you can just say D&D, then it would have a very tight running with Lord of the Rings in my list.
Yeah.
Sure.
On its own.
Now, there's no single D&D story that would be remotely close to the Lord of the Rings.
No.
And no one would argue that. But
hopefully not.
Hopefully, you know what?
Somebody would argue it, but they would be wrong.
They'd be
incorrect. Argue it in the comments below.
That's true. If you really hate Tom Bombadil that much, like me, but Lord of the Rings is still that good. It lives up.
Yeah.
Braylon?
So my number 1 is again, it is not a specific world. My number 1 is folk tales and fairy stories.
Okay.
Okay, really. You're gonna have to define this. What is in folktales and fairy stories?
So this is like the old like I would not classify this as Disney.
But would you say like Grimm's fairy tales?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Hans Christian Andersen's tales.
Yes.
Yep.
I would include those in that, and I would mostly just say like this is like Tolkien has kind of defined modern fantasy. Fairy stories are the baseline of fantasy. Like this is the original story around a campfire where we have fairies, we have elves, we have these dwarves, we have all of these different things that are all getting kind of pulled into one setting. It's not a world per se. Like there's not a map associated with any of these places. But it is a setting that I think that everybody pulls from.
The thing is, it's like I hear what you're saying, but the issue I have with it is
it's incredibly broad.
Well, the problem is it's like I don't think it makes sense as a setting because it's true that like there are things that are shared culturally.
Yeah.
But even if we talk about any of the specifics, like Grimm's fairy tales are a collection of fairy stories brought together and defined.
Yeah.
but if we go outside of a specific thing, we're just talking generally about how people see the world and people's superstitions and ideas like that. So it's like I wouldn't consider just general shared storytelling as a setting together.
I wouldn't either. I'm talking more about the ones that are in those common collections that are still prevalent through everybody's conscience.
Yeah.
The Disney stories are some of them. I don't particularly like most of the Disney versions.
Yeah.
Especially the more modern ones, I don't think quite fall into that same fantasy story. Not that there's necessarily a problem with them as a whole; they just don't fit into that setting.
Exactly.
But like the original Rapunzel does, Tangled, not so much. The Snow Queen does.
Yes.
Frozen, not so much.
Exactly.
And I think as far as like global impact, I couldn't come up with something that has done more. I do understand the caveat of it's not a world like in and of itself. There aren't laws that govern all of it.
Yeah.
But it was just something that I was just like the cultural impact that this has had across every continent, every country, and every people is just like it was hard for me to not put it at one.
Yeah. The problem for me with putting something like that on the list is more to the lack. Well, so it loses points on the not being a super well-defined like individual setting, but also not having a consistent canon to where we can say, when you say fairy now, do you mean like, like the fairy in like an Irish fairy tale or like the fairy in like a Belarusian fairy tale?
I would say yes.
Like there is like a loose collection of what you would consider to be fairy tale logic. It's like what I was bringing up with Marvel. There's superhero logic.
Yeah.
There are things that make sense in superhero world.
Yeah.
And there is a fairy tale world where these things sort of things make sense.
Yep.
Long lost orphan child. The way that fairies work. A tough bargain. Things like that. Yep. Those do kind of exist. I would classify it. I think like it's like if we would consider fairy tales and fairy stories to be clear, I would also then consider Greek mythology to be in the same sort of category. But
I think the difference that I would put is that like Greek mythology, at least originally, not so much anymore, but it was just like, this is the story of our religion.
Yeah.
And that's not as true. That's not as true with most of the fairy stories. There are certainly some that kind of, especially more so in like Irish folk stories, have a lot of that kind of Celtic mythology wrapped up in it.
It's true.
For sure. But that's not pervasive across all of it to the point where I would just say, yep, this as its thing, just as a whole, is religious and not fantasy.
Exactly. So
makes sense.
So at the top of our list, we have Middle Earth.
Yep.
We have fairy tales, and we have Dungeons and Dragons.
Yep.
So Middle Earth 2, the sequel with less goodness. But
and honestly, since Tolkien's Legendarium is just Fairy Tales, the sequel, really, you're just picking Fairy Tales 3. So
it's true. But you see how divorced they are from one another.
Oh,
like
for
how much
sure.
Again, there's not going to be a dragonborn in fairy stories.
No.
That's not how it goes.
Nope.
But what if that was fun to play in a tabletop game?
It is.
Sounds like a blast.
Yeah.
Cool. So we've had some interesting lists.
Yeah.
A lot of shared. I think my list has the most things not on other people's lists.
I think the only things that have crossed over are Middle Earth is on everybody's list and D&D is on everybody's list, and I think that's it. I think everybody else is
we have
the remaining three are completely original.
That's fair. Okay.
True.
Yeah.
Although most of the things that people came up with ended up in somebody else's honorable mention.
Yeah.
Yes. No one went too far off the rails.
Yeah.
I think people would have gotten too upset if I put down Dark Souls or something. That was a bit too far.
I wouldn't have probably fought you on it. I don't think I would have said, oh, it belongs in a top 5.
Yeah.
If you had it as your 9 or your 8 or whatever, I'd be like, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. If we were doing top 15 lists.
Yeah.
Maybe. Cool.
Yeah.
So those are the definitive 3 ways that you can look at the top 5 most impactful worlds in fantasy. If you really want to, you could put down your list, but like, I mean, you're going to be correct. I'm just saying.
Here's the way to make it correct. Make sure it's the exact same as one of the 3 that we've already pitched.
There you go.
It's true. This has been our episode.
What we've
today.
learned is if you include Middle-earth and D&D on your list, it's, you're at least 2/5 of the way correct.
I mean, that's not a passing grade anywhere, but
no,
just guess on the other slots you might get there.
Yeah.
Cool. I think that's all we got for you guys today. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. It was fun to do.
Yeah.
See you guys later.
Peace.